The day Claire signed the lease for the old house at the edge of town, she told herself it was the best decision for her and Jamie. After all, they had no other options. The rent was dirt cheap, almost suspiciously so, but as a single mother barely scraping by, she couldn't afford to ask too many questions. Her 10-year-old son, Jamie, deserved a roof over his head, even if it was a roof that leaked. The house stood alone, surrounded by withered trees and a field of weeds that seemed to swallow the yard. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, with peeling paint, sagging gutters, and windows that seemed to stare back at them. Jamie wrinkled his nose as they pulled into the gravel driveway. "Mom, this place is creepy," he said, his voice small. Claire forced a smile. "It's not creepy, Jamie. It's vintage. It'll be an adventure." Jamie didn't look convinced, and neither was she. But there was no turning back now. The first night moving in was uneventful, though Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jamie spent the day unpacking his boxes while she cleaned layers of grime from the kitchen. By nightfall, the house still smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, but exhaustion silenced her concerns. The first night, Claire woke to the sound of footsteps creaking across the floor above her bedroom. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to listen. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. "Jamie?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping up the narrow staircase to Jamie's room. She found him fast asleep, his small body tangled in the covers. The floorboards groaned beneath her as she backed out of the room, her pulse still pounding in her ears. "It's just an old house," she told herself. Old houses make noise. But deep down, she knew it wasn't the house. The next morning, Jamie was unusually quiet. He picked at his cereal, his eyes darting toward the walls as if he could hear something she couldn't. "Everything okay?" Claire asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just tired." Claire didn't press him, but she noticed his hands trembling as he carried his bowl to the sink. She chalked it up to nerves. Moving to a new place was hard for anyone, especially a kid. But as the days passed, Jamie's behavior grew stranger. He began drawing pictures of the house, but in his sketches, it was surrounded by shadowy figures with hollow eyes. When she asked about them, he shrugged. "They're the people who used to live here," he said matter-of-factly. "What do you mean?" "I hear them at night," Jamie whispered. "They talk to me through the walls." She wanted to dismiss it as an overactive imagination, but the unease in his voice was too real. That night, she pressed her ear to the wall in her bedroom, holding her breath. At first, she heard nothing but the hum of silence. Then, faintly, she heard it, a whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. "Get out." The whispers escalated, and Claire began to notice other things, doors opening on their own, lights flickering, shadows that didn't belong. One afternoon, while cleaning out the basement, she found something that made her stomach churn. A box of old photographs lay buried under a pile of rotting cardboard. The images were faded, but they all showed the same family, a mother, a father, and 2 children. In each picture, their faces were obscured by dark smudges, as if someone had deliberately erased them. Claire shoved the box back into the corner and hurried upstairs, her hands shaking. She didn't want to know who they were. She didn't want to know what had happened to them. That night, Jamie woke her with a scream. She bolted into his room to find him sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide with terror. "He was here," Jamie sobbed. "The man from the basement. He said he's going to take me." Claire's heart clenched. She wrapped her arms around him, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, keeping watch as shadows seemed to crawl across the walls. The breaking point as the weeks went on, the house's malevolence became impossible to ignore. Claire's dreams were plagued by visions of fire and blood, of a family screaming for help. Jamie began talking to someone who wasn't there, his small voice carrying on hushed conversations that made her skin crawl. One evening, as they ate dinner, the lights flickered and died. The room was plunged into darkness, and Claire felt the air grow heavy, almost suffocating. Jamie's chair scraped against the floor as he bolted upright. "He's here," Jamie whispered. The room filled with an icy chill, and Claire could see her breath misting in the air. A low growl echoed from the shadows, followed by the sound of footsteps dragging across the floor. Claire grabbed Jamie and ran. They stumbled into the living room, where the front door slammed shut on its own, locking them inside. The growling grew louder, closer, and Claire's mind raced with desperation. "What do you want?" she screamed, her voice breaking. The growling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, low and guttural, answered, "Leave." Leaving wasn't an option. Claire had no savings, no family to turn to, and nowhere else to go. The house's cheap rent was the only thing keeping them off the streets. But the entity, whatever it was growing stronger, more aggressive. It wasn't just haunting them, it was hunting them. Claire turned to the internet, searching for answers. She found stories of the house, tales of tragedy and death. The family and the photographs had lived there decades ago. They'd been murdered in their sleep, their killer never caught. Some said the father had gone mad and killed them himself before taking his own life. Others whispered of something darker, something inhuman. Desperate, Claire reached out to a local paranormal investigator named Evelyn. When Evelyn arrived, she immediately sensed the house's malevolence. "This place is a gateway," Evelyn said, her voice grim. "Something evil is tethered here. It feeds on fear, and it's latched onto you and your son." Evelyn performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting prayers. For a moment, the house seemed to calm, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. But as night fell, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. Evelyn insisted they confront the entity directly. She set up cameras and equipment in the living room, preparing for a confrontation. Claire and Jamie huddled together as Evelyn began her ritual, her voice firm and commanding. The house erupted in chaos. Furniture toppled over, windows shattered, and the air filled with an ear-splitting screech. A dark figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and writhing as it approached them. "You are not welcome here," Evelyn shouted, holding up a talisman. "By the light, I banish you." The entity howled, its form recoiling as the talisman glowed with an intense light. But it wasn't enough. The entity lunged at Evelyn, knocking her to the ground. Claire grabbed Jamie and backed into a corner, her heart pounding. "Mom," Jamie whispered, clutching her arm. "I know what it wants." He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of his drawings, the house surrounded by shadowy figures. In the center, he had drawn a door, its outline glowing. "It's trapped here," Jamie said. "We have to let it go." Claire didn't understand, but she trusted him. Together, they approached the dark figure, holding out the drawing. Jamie whispered something under his breath, and the figure froze. The room filled with a blinding light, and the entity let out a final, ear-piercing scream before vanishing. Aftermath: the house fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. Evelyn, bruised but alive, confirmed that the entity was gone. Claire and Jamie moved out the next day, leaving the house and its horrors behind. They found a small apartment in a crowded building, far from the isolation of the old house. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. Still, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. Late at night, when the world was quiet, she would sometimes hear a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Get out." The days in the old house stretched long and heavy. Claire and Jamie, who once held on to the fragile hope that they could endure the haunting presence, began to feel the weight of their decision to stay. The oppressive air, the chilling whispers, and the unrelenting shadows seemed to grow more malevolent with each passing moment. One rainy afternoon, while Jamie was at school, Claire decided to confront her fears. She had heard the faint creaking of footsteps above her bedroom every night, and the attic door, painted appealing white, had become a symbol of her dread. With a flashlight in hand and her heart pounding, Claire climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of mildew and rot thickening. When she pushed the attic door open, it let out a long, wailing creak. The room was cluttered with old furniture draped in dusty sheets, cardboard boxes spilling with yellowed papers, and a broken rocking chair that swayed ever so slightly, though no breeze stirred. On the far side of the attic, Claire spotted an old wooden trunk. Its metal clasps were rusted, and its surface was scratched and gouged as if something had tried to claw its way inside. She hesitated, but curiosity, and a strange compulsion, drove her forward. Kneeling before the trunk, she unlatched the clasps and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, she found a collection of faded photographs, handwritten letters, and a leather-bound diary. The photographs depicted the house in its earlier days, surrounded by a family who seemed happy and content. But as Claire flipped through them, the images darkened. Faces blurred into unrecognizable smears, and shadows crept into the corners of the frames, growing larger and more menacing with each photo. The diary, however, was the most unsettling discovery. Its pages were filled with erratic handwriting, detailing the life of the house's previous occupant, a woman named Margaret. Margaret wrote of her growing paranoia, of hearing voices that weren't there, and of shadows that moved when they shouldn't. The final entry chilled Claire to her core. The house watches. The house waits. It has taken them all, and now it comes for me. If you find this, leave. Leave before it's too late. Before Claire could process the message, the attic door slammed shut. The rocking chair began to rock violently, and the temperature plummeted. Claire felt an icy hand brush against her shoulder, and a raspy voice whispered in her ear, "You shouldn't have come." She bolted from the attic, leaving the diary and photographs behind. The door slammed again as she reached the bottom of the stairs, sealing the horrors within. Meanwhile, Jamie was struggling at school. His once bright and inquisitive nature had dimmed. He no longer spoke to his classmates, and his drawings, which had once been filled with vibrant colors and happy scenes, now depicted dark, twisted images of the house and the figures that lurked within it. One day, his teacher, Ms. Rayner, pulled Claire aside during pickup. "Jamie's been having a tough time," she said gently. "He's quiet, withdrawn. And these drawings." She handed Claire a folder filled with Jamie's sketches. One showed a figure with hollow eyes and a grotesque grin standing at the foot of Jamie's bed. Another depicted the attic door, with dark tendrils seeping from the cracks. That evening, Claire confronted Jamie. "Sweetheart, why are you drawing these things? Did you see something in the house?" Jamie hesitated before nodding. "I see them at night," he whispered. "They come out of the walls and watch me. They're angry, Mom. They don't want us here." Claire pulled him close, her heart breaking. "We'll figure this out," she promised, though she had no idea how. As the weeks passed, the activity in the house intensified. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects flew off shelves, and the whispers grew louder, turning into guttural voices that echoed through the halls. But the most terrifying occurrences centered around the basement. Claire had always avoided the basement. Its door, located at the end of a narrow hallway, was padlocked when they first moved in. She had assumed it was simply used for storage, but now she wasn't so sure. One night, as she was preparing for bed, she heard a rhythmic knocking coming from the basement door. It was slow and deliberate, each knock echoing like a heartbeat. Gathering her courage, she approached the door and placed her ear against it. "Claire," a voice whispered from the other side. "Let me in." She stumbled back, her blood turning to ice. The knocking stopped, but the voice began to laugh, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to rattle the very walls. She ran to her room, locking the door behind her, and stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a kitchen knife. The next morning, she found the padlock lying on the floor, broken in two. The basement door was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase descending into pitch-black darkness. Claire knew she couldn't face this alone. She reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a man named Daniel who had a reputation for dealing with malevolent spirits. When he arrived, he immediately sensed the house's oppressive energy. "This place is a conduit," he explained as he set up his equipment. "Something dark happened here, and it's feeding off your fear." Daniel placed motion sensors, cameras, and audio recorders throughout the house. As night fell, he, Claire, and Jamie gathered in the living room, where the activity was most concentrated. They didn't have to wait long. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the lights flickered. One of the cameras captured a shadow moving across the room, though no one was there. The whispers began again, growing louder and more insistent. "It's in the basement," Daniel said, his voice tense. "We need to confront it." Claire hesitated, but Jamie grabbed her hand. "We have to, Mom," he said. "It won't stop until we do." Armed with flashlights and Daniel's equipment, the three descended into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the oppressive darkness seemed to swallow their light. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small, dirt-floored room with strange symbols carved into the walls. In the center of the room stood a wooden altar, its surface stained dark with something that looked alarmingly like blood. As they approached, the whispers turned into screams, and the shadows began to coalesce into a single, towering figure. The entity was grotesque, its form shifting and writhing as if it were made of smoke and shadows. Its hollow eyes locked onto Claire and Jamie, and it let out a bone-chilling roar. "Leave this place!" Daniel shouted, holding up a crucifix. The entity recoiled but didn't retreat. Instead, it lashed out, sending Daniel flying against the wall. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Claire grabbed Jamie and held him close as the entity advanced. "Why won't you let us go?" she screamed. The entity paused, its form flickering. Then, in a voice that was both many and one, it spoke, "This house is mine. You are mine." Summoning all her courage, Claire grabbed a piece of chalk from Daniel's bag and hastily redrew the symbols on the walls, following the instructions he had given her earlier. As she completed the final symbol, the entity let out an ear-piercing scream and began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into wisps of smoke. The house shook violently, and the walls began to crack. Claire grabbed Jamie and dragged Daniel up the stairs just as the basement collapsed in on itself, sealing whatever remained of the entity below. As they stood outside, gasping for breath, Claire looked back at the house. It was still standing, but it seemed to sag, as if the life had been drained from it. She knew they couldn't stay any longer, but where would they go? They had no money, no other options. "Mom," Jamie said, his voice trembling. "It's not over. I can still feel it." Claire squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. She knew he was right. The darkness wasn't confined to the house. It had latched onto them, and it wouldn't let go. Their fight was far from over. The haunted house, a new beginning. As dawn broke over the old house, Claire and Jamie sat together in the living room, their hands entwined. The night had been long and terrifying, but for the first time, they felt a glimmer of hope. The entity that had haunted them for months was no longer there. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive shadows had receded. It was as if the house itself had taken a breath of relief. The power of family. The turning point had come when Claire and Jamie, united in their resolve, faced the entity together. Claire had remembered her late husband's words about the power of love and resilience. She had taken Jamie's hand and declared that they would not live in fear any longer. Their bond, their love for each other, had been the ultimate weapon against the darkness. When the entity had appeared, it seemed weaker, almost hesitant. Claire had shouted at it, her voice steady and firm, "You will not take us. We are stronger than you." Jamie had joined her, his voice echoing hers. The shadows had retreated, and the house had grown silent. The entity was gone, banished by the strength of their unity. In the days that followed, Claire and Jamie worked tirelessly to make the house feel like a home. They repainted the walls, letting in the sunlight that had been absent for so long. The eerie whispers and cold drafts were gone, replaced by warmth and laughter. The house, once a place of fear, became a sanctuary. Neighbors who had once avoided the house began to visit, bringing over food and sharing stories about the neighborhood. Claire found a sense of community she hadn't felt in years. Jamie, too, made friends at school and began to smile more often. The shadows that had loomed over their lives were now distant memories. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Claire stood in the garden, planting flowers with Jamie. The once dead soil now teemed with life, a symbol of their new beginning. As they worked, they talked and laughed, their voices carrying through the air. "Mom," Jamie said, wiping dirt from his hands, "do you think Dad would be proud of us?" Claire paused, her eyes shining with tears. "I think he would be more than proud, Jamie. I think he'd be happy to see us thriving." The garden bloomed, just as their lives had. The house, once a place of fear and despair, now stood as a testament to their resilience and love. Claire and Jamie had not only survived, they had triumphed. Together, they had turned a nightmare into a dream. As the sun set that evening, Claire and Jamie sat on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. They knew that challenges would come, but they also knew they could face anything as long as they had each other. The haunted house was no longer haunted,